So we'll start with the grounding practice, and then we can come back and Claire will then start her presentation. So if you'd like to settle, whatever posture you find most helpful. So just take a few moments just to arrive. Let go of any busyness you might have in your mind from earlier today, or any thoughts of planning and things to do later. And just allow yourself to become fully present to this interesting discussion that we're going to have today around the new normal. Allow your awareness just to, with the force of gravity, drop to your feet, just all the way down your body, so that you are noticing the sensation of the pressure of your feet, contact of your feet with the ground, the earth beneath us. And then allowing the awareness to rise up your body, so you're noticing the pressure, sensation, the connection of your bottom with the seat beneath you. Noticing the softness of a cushion or the hardness of the seat. So we're establishing a firm foundation with the earth. And then lengthen your spine, so you're lifting the upper part of your body, opening your chest, make space for the breath, softening your shoulders, traveling into your face, so allowing the muscles in your jaw to soften, the muscles around your eyes and the eyeballs themselves to soften, and your forehead, any tension in your forehead that might manifest as a furrowed brow, just let those muscles soften there. And then right to the crown of the head, you can imagine there's a line from the ceiling, just holding your body up from the crown of your head, just lifting your body so that your skeleton is straight but not too erect. So you have this posture of relaxed alertness. And then just to help this process, we take 3 deep breaths into our belly, and then exhaling slowly and allowing any tension to just disappear with the out breath of the 3 breaths. And then just settling back on the natural in-breath and out-breath. And in the space of your mind, just ask yourself the question, why am I here today? What is my intention for being here? And maybe ask, why am I really here? See if there's a a deeper, more subtle intention that it's not coming to mind immediately. If nothing comes, that's fine, but just allow yourself to ask yourself the question, why am I really here today? What might my deeper intention be? So in a few seconds, I'm going to put you into 8 rooms, 3 people per room. Just allow you a couple of minutes each just to say hello. If there are new people that you've not met before, introduce yourself. And if you wish, just maybe share what your intention is for coming today. But no obligation there. If there's nothing coming up for you, that's fine also. As I'm sure everyone else does. We've got your bank account up here, but
Sorry, just bear with me while I find the. I've also got 2 screens, and it's just.
Yeah, I've got your growing forward up now slide.
Yeah, I just should be able to see my notes as well.
Okay.
There we go. Okay.
Oh,
Program. Right. So, thanks so much for inviting me to come and talk to you. I did this talk to an Extinction Rebellion group probably about a month ago. Hey, Paul.
I think before, actually, I was looking back. I think it may have been
Before, yeah.
6 weeks ago or something. Lynn might know, she was there. She's here.
Scary amount of time is passing. Anyway, Paul was kind enough to ask me to perform it again and talk to some more people about it. So I should just give a little bit of background. I'm Australian, as you may be able to tell, and I've got a background in environmental science, and more recently I completed a PhD, and I now work at the University of Bristol as a lecturer. So this is very much my kind of agenda as an environmentalist, but I think it's one that I hope will ring true with quite a few of you. And I suppose it's about opportunities as well as some of the bad things that are happening. You know, the pandemic has been a time of very rapid change, although it might feel like nothing is changing at the moment, but certainly those first few weeks of lockdown were, you know, seemed like everything was happening. And it's very stressful for many, many people. But it's also a time, I think, for reflecting and refocusing. For us, you know, we're very privileged. Our lives have been disrupted, but we're not destitute. But it's certainly given us a lot of things to think about. And I think there is an appetite for change, and clearly that's in your intentions that I saw today as well. This is back in April. I think it's a poll from the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. And this is showing, even quite early in lockdown, a strong appetite for change. I hope to change some things about my life. And I hope we will have learned from this crisis as a country. That's the big orange line across the top of it. So I think, you know, there's a lot of opportunities as a society, but also on a more personal level for us to think about what is it that we don't want to go back to, if you like. This is more recently, this is the Climate Assembly UK. It has 108 members that are supposed to be representative of the population here. They ended up meeting 6 times in the first half of 2020. And they've just recently released the results of this survey with their members. So first of all, nearly 80% say that the government needs to redesign its way forward to help achieve net zero. So this is all about the economic recovery. And the other really important thing is that the government employers and ourselves need to all take steps to achieve more carbon neutral lifestyles, which for me also means addressing many other aspects of the environmental and social impacts of our lifestyles as well. So I think many of us like the idea that something good can come out of something so terrible. And although a lot of the focus is on climate change for the Climate Assembly and for many of us, I think the broader themes are all very strongly interlinked anyway. So in today's session, I've done a not particularly academically rigorous analysis, but I have been looking at media articles and commentary from the sources like The Conversation, BBC, an Australian equivalent of BBC, The Guardian, mostly sort of more left of centre sources, I guess, but I think still capturing key points. So I've got 7 themed or 7 areas of change, and for each of them there's some good, there's some bad, there's some pretty ugly going on. And I'm going to draw quite a few parallels between the COVID-19 and climate change. I'm not the only one drawing these parallels. A lot of academics and environmentalists are doing that. You yourselves are doing that. And we're all talking about what can we learn and what can we do. So I'm going to talk for around 15, 20 minutes, and then I think Paul's got more plans for us after that. But particularly as I talk through this, just think about which of these particularly resonate with you, and what would you like to, I guess, reject or retain or reform, adopt perhaps in a different way. So let's go into the first theme. I call it social cohesion or social capital. Lots of nice things coming out of all of this: generosity, sharing, focusing on the important things, simplifying our lives, meeting our neighbours. But there's been some pretty ugly things as well. We've got people locked out at home with their abusers. We've got xenophobia, cases of people, for example, boycotting Chinese restaurants early on in the pandemic. I think in the UK, it has been really wonderfully surprising how much social capital remains. And by social capital, I mean things like social cohesion and sharing values, and not necessarily religious or ideological values, but values like safety, education, health, those sorts of things. And being willing to invest in one's community, and socially distancing and staying at home is actually a massive investment that we make in our community. So given the decades of austerity, the divisiveness of Brexit, I think it's really quite wonderful how much of this social capital remains in the UK. Of course, it doesn't remain everywhere. This is recent scenes in the United States. Here, I think social capital has been much more eroded. Divisions in society are really standing out much more. It's very much an everyone for themselves approach. You know, even the White House didn't actually want to share federal stockpiles of PPE with the different states. It's important to note that these far-right groups are also very socially cohesive, perhaps not holding a lot of social capital, but it's really important to remember history tells us that while these sort of times can bring us together, they can also allow these quite extreme groups, these really quite frightening elements to flourish. And, you know, you can also see that the leadership in the US is really giving these groups the oxygen and the ignition source that they need to flourish. So that's the scary side of the first theme. My second theme is around new ways of communicating and interacting. And this is actually my birthday, a couple of days after we went into lockdown. And this is actually my family who are scattered around Australia. And we did a Zoom call and we agreed it was so great, we're doing it every month now. So, you know, we're having quite good meetings by video links, Skype, Zoom, all sorts of different things. Here we are today, gathering in exactly this way. And in fact, it allows us to come together with people who are geographically dispersed. So, you know, that's pretty terrific. We've overcome what seemed like impossible barriers to holding meetings online. But here's my family in a different time, another family gathering. And of course, here's the thing that we're really missing at the moment. We're still not allowed to do very much of this at all in the UK. So, you know, I'd ask the question, how important is this face-to-face contact in building and maintaining relationships? How important are these things to our long-term mental health? What are the implications of social isolation and social distancing to our long-term mental health? You know, I found myself going out a few weeks ago feeling quite upset about a few things, and I actually got more upset because people were stepping aside and avoiding me, and I actually found that quite confronting, even though most of the time during lockdown I've appreciated people's efforts to keep out of my way. So certainly some things to think about there as well. Another key theme is around jobs in the economy. The first really, pleasant surprise is that we can prioritise people's lives over money, over the economy. That is really good to know. But also, I think this situation has shown up some serious weaknesses in our economic models. Neoliberalism, the globalisation of industry and production, these models have not set us up at all well for the kind of rapid changes that coronavirus has brought us. Perhaps the most important shift is that we're realising who are really the essential workers. They're not in finance, they're not the venture capitalists or the property developers or the hedge fund managers. They're the people who we have long undervalued and underappreciated. What's also striking is that these essential workers tend to be in the least secure, most poorly paid jobs with the fewest rights. They're often shift workers, and also their jobs are often almost physical, so they can't work remotely. So right throughout this pandemic, throughout this lockdown period, these people have been showing up in person to work, to keep everything going, and are not necessarily being protected. We're conveniently ignoring the fact that the wonderful waste collection crews that come around our streets once a week, they're not able to sit in the cab of those trucks with 2 or 3 workers and be socially distanced. So we're just kind of letting some of these things go by. So these people really are on the front line. I think it really brings into question workers' rights. How do we protect and value these workers? There's no sign yet that, these guys are going to get the massive pay rises that they probably deserve. And then finally, I guess for those of us who are lucky enough to be able to work from home, there's also possibly a new way of doing things that might fundamentally change the way we work as well. My fourth theme is welfare and social services. So in times of crisis, we tend to look to our governments. We have a new appreciation, I guess, of these services. And we've seen the UK government and many other governments around the world introduce welfare reforms and schemes that they previously said were just impossible. So things like the furlough scheme, a £76 million package to support the most vulnerable in society. In Australia, when the government realised that so many people were going to go onto the unemployment benefits, they doubled the benefit because they realised that in fact people can't live on the pitiful amount that was previously provided. But it's been a scramble. Existing unemployment schemes have been overwhelmed. New schemes like the furlough scheme have been hard to access. They've been confusing. We've got decades of austerity and underfunding in the UK, leave social services really struggling to respond. Charities that are underfunded and unable to keep going without their normal fundraising activities. In Australia, the rules for the worker support excluded many particularly vulnerable people who work in casual and flexible employment. And it seems like, I sometimes feel that maybe our politicians are actually, and their advisors, are so privileged that they've actually got no idea that these people are even out there that are this vulnerable. We're also seeing overseas some really frightening scenes of human rights violations. So governments are using this as an excuse to potentially trample over human rights, repress the free flow of information, and these are concerns that the United Nations has been raising. There's also, interestingly, claims that countries with stronger welfare systems are handling these socioeconomic shocks a lot better. So this picture is from Mauritius. Now, Mauritius has a very strong social protection system, and research showed it did very well after the GFC 2008. And again, it's been able to respond much more smoothly and quickly to the coronavirus. There's a lot more social capital, more safety nets in place, and so on. And finally, encouragingly, some countries are also thinking about things like a universal basic wage. Now, I wonder if these things will hang about. But yeah, some interesting changes that certainly our governments would have told us 6 months ago were just not possible. My next theme is around inequality. And, you know, some people say, oh, well, we're all in the same boat, but it's not true. We may be in the same storm, but we are certainly not in the same boat. You know, who knew what a privilege it would be to be able to stay at home and not see anyone and socially distance yourself. You know, to be able to socially isolate, you need to have a comfortable house, a job that lets you work from home, be able to afford home deliveries. If your children are going to succeed in home schooling, you need to have good Wi-Fi. Each child needs a laptop or a tablet of its own, a quiet place to work, and also a school that's willing and able to support. So the virus is very discriminatory. We've already seen quite a lot of evidence that more deprived, more socially and economically vulnerable areas are seeing much higher levels of infection and deaths. In my hometown of Melbourne, just in the last couple of days, areas of state-provided housing have had to be put into complete lockdown, no going out at all, because they're very crowded. Everyone shares laundries, the lifts are very small. There's no way that people can stay away from each other. So the more contact you have with each other, either because you live in more crowded housing or because your jobs don't allow you to stay at home, means that you're more likely to be affected by this virus. And generally, this group of the population also have poorer health generally. And, you know, worldwide, 40% of the world's population don't even have access to hand washing facilities at home, the number one most simple way to prevent this virus. And of course, for women as well, women tend to be are more likely to be in insecure jobs, so more affected by businesses closing, often not as easily able to access some of these support schemes. It seems like domestic violence is on the rise, and also research has shown that women are taking on more than men in relation to childcare, homeschooling, all those sorts of things. Now, none of this is new. These inequalities were already there. We already have far too many people working in poorly paid, insecure jobs, people who can barely make ends meet each week, let alone have any contingency funds. But these gaps are being exacerbated greatly by this virus and by the lockdown that we need to manage the virus. So the people who can least afford to respond are the hardest hit, and it's really unjust. And of course, that makes you think, well, what's going to happen as the effects of climate change and global heating continue to accelerate? How much more of this are we going to see? And this photo is actually from the United States after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. So inequality, I think, is a major issue that we really have to keep working on and thinking about. My sixth theme is environment and emissions. So air pollution's down. We're chatting in my little chat room about air quality. This will save lives. Around 4.2 million people every year die directly as a result of outdoor air quality. We've got swans in the canals in Venice, animals taking over the streets, all sorts of good stories about how you can see Mount Everest now from Kathmandu, all sorts of good stories. Greenhouse gas emissions are down. We should see probably maybe a 5 to 7.5% reduction in 2020. And that's terrific, except that we need to see more like a 7 or 8% reduction per annum if we're going to keep to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And you're probably also asking why only 7.5%? You know, surely it's more than that. But, you know, we are still using electricity, heating, things are still being manufactured. The cows are still farting on the farms and so on. So what this really highlights is it's not really a case of each of us to modify our lifestyle. What we do or don't do isn't all that important. We must have some structural and system change. And also these reductions, even though, you know, they're important, have not led to any change in the atmospheric carbon dioxide or carbon levels. We hit 417 ppm in May 2020. So the actual reductions are very, very little compared to the cumulative total. And we need to also consider the long residence time and residual emissions that are still going on in the background. So ultimately, we're not necessarily going to see a big change in our emissions profile unless we have much more structural change. Seeing reduced food waste, people eating more fresh food. But what about hospital waste? Now that restaurants around here are opening up for takeaway, we're seeing heaps and heaps of, plastic waste and those sorts of things. We've got wins for wildlife in rich countries, but in poorer countries, ecotourism and wildlife tourism was critical to be able to afford to maintain protection and management, and those funds have dried up. And also in poorer countries, will people be forced to use environmental resources just to stay alive? Another big scary thing is deregulation. So COP26, which many people consider was the absolute last chance for our governments to come together and do anything about climate change, has been postponed. The big polluters are already lobbying for relaxation of carbon and other emissions to help them recover. We've seen big rollbacks in the US. We've seen the Australian government backing a gas-led recovery when it really makes much more economic sense to further accelerate the transition to renewables. And here's another recent headline from Australia, looking to cut the environmental laws to accelerate these fast-track big projects that are supposed to stimulate the economy. So my final theme, being a scientist myself, you have to always return to the role of science. People like me have been howling for years at the government ignoring advice of scientists on climate change issues. But in this case, scientists are being listened to. Science got us into this lockdown. But it is very interesting to think about how governments have responded to uncertainty. Some took very conservative approaches. Others actually used uncertainty as an excuse not to act. And, this kind of science, the science of pandemics, the science of climate change, it's very complex. It's hard to communicate. It's very hard to establish the sort of causal relationships that our politicians want to hear about. People have expressed a lot of doubt and frustration. We've seen a lot of science on the run. Just a few days ago, there were lots of articles circulating about whether reducing distancing from 2 meters to 1+, whatever that means, was acceptable. This morning's news contained more information about studies about just to what extent this virus is transmitted by airborne particulates. Some feel that scientists have not put the risk in perspective, the risk of not acting versus the risk to life and health from the economic chaos, reduced access to hospital services, all that sort of thing. But I suppose you've also got to ask the question, what's the balance between the role of scientists and the role of politicians? Plenty of people are saying, well, the scientists got overexcited and the politicians overreacted. Did we need this kind of hospital? In the end, these were not filled up, partly because there weren't actually the people to staff it. But, was this an over-response or an under-response? We've seen under-responses quite disastrously in some countries. And of course, as ever with science, there's plenty of misinformation, plenty of hoaxes, plenty of suggestions about spurious treatments, plenty of people denying science, claiming conspiracies, all that sort of thing. The Guardian goes so far as to say that, again, it's a case of the right denying science because it conflicts with their aggressive economic growth and job creation paradigms. So it makes us really ask, what is the role of science? What is the role of scientists? Is it up to scientists simply to interpret the science and hand the reports over? What do scientists do about things like uncertainty and complexity? To what extent should we be interpreting risk and giving policy advice? Should we be lobbying? Should we actually be scaring people a lot more than we really are? So I think that's an important thing for us to think about. So back to climate change, it all comes back to climate change, I guess. I don't particularly like this meme. It's been circulating a little bit. Climate advocates have never called the economy to be stopped. But we do know that climate change will lead to similar situations, similar shocks, and possibly even more problematic because they're not reversible. There's no chance of recovery. There isn't a vaccine for climate change. So as far as I'm concerned, this has been a disastrous stress rehearsal. While many good things have come out of it, it's shown that we are not prepared for the shocks of climate change. And it's also reinforced that something like climate change is not an environmental issue. It's very much a social and economic issue. So 6 of those 7 themes are really about social and economic issues. So I've been thinking and reading a lot more about the economy during lockdown. You know, I used to see the economy as kind of the enemy of environmental protection, this beast that had to keep being fed. But I think, like many of us, including our very fine politicians, I've been framing it a bit too narrowly and doing a disservice to many excellent and very learned economists around the world. So now I'm trying to see the economy a bit differently. It's really a social system that deals with producing and distributing resources, goods and services that we humans need to survive. For a long time, though, we've lost control of this system. It's taken on a life of its own. It's basically been servicing a very, very small number of elite people and helping them get much, much more wealthy, while masquerading perhaps as being the mechanism by which the rest of us get access to goods and services, but clearly with increasing levels of inequity. So we built it, but now it's been hijacked by this very small minority. And we need to actually get some control back over what this economy actually is and what we want from it. This requires a very big change, though. At the moment, success is based on a single measure. It's based on GDP, gross domestic product. We've got to challenge that conceptualization of the economy very hard. We're going to talk about the correlation between GDP and happiness, for example. So overall, I'm convinced that we need to move to a new economic model. And I will talk very briefly about some of those models. We need a just transition to get us to those models. So I'm going to talk very briefly and very inexpertly about where that's heading, but also perhaps if you want to follow some of these things up yourself, you'll have that opportunity. So I'm going to skip that slide on to this one. So a different model going forward. We need to make this system work for us, not against us. It should be founded on sustainability, on ideas of inter and intra-generational equity, so current and future generations. Social resilience, maintaining resource stocks, social justice. We need to act dramatically to cut emissions. We need to forget about Paris and all those agreements. The newest advice is that we need to be carbon neutral in the next 10 to 20 years. Even 2050 is probably getting way too late. And that also won't stop global heating. So we also need to be much more prepared to be resilient to the shocks that we know are going to come, even if we can hold global heating to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. And that's particularly where this pandemic has a lot to teach us. So we need to prioritise industries and businesses that look at restoring nature, cutting emissions, promoting well-being. We've got to let the polluting industries go. We've got to focus ourselves on what really matters, and we've got to act with urgency. And we have seen our governments make very sweeping, rapid changes, particularly in social welfare. And we're going to need to make a lot more of those if we're going to keep this infection under control in the next year or two, while also maintaining some kind of a stable economy. So it's really important. We know that from previous economic disruptions that our governments use big economic stimulus packages to recover. And this is a huge opportunity, but also a massive threat. So it all depends where we are, where the government puts its stimulus. So we need to act urgently. We need to listen to scientists. Fortunately, there is a lot of very sound work being done over the last decade or even longer about new economic models. There's lots to work from. There's a bit of a spectrum from what I've been reading. They all focus on different kinds of growth. So they all say we have to get away from this idea of growth in GDP. And there's some that just talk about a different type of growth. There's models around zero growth and even degrowth. So I'll just talk very, very quickly about some of these and hope you'll forgive me for any inaccuracies if there's any economists out there. The first is the Green New Deal. This was developed by an economic think tank. It's very sound economically. Some have criticised it as being perhaps not possible, but I also think that it is the only way that we can potentially go forward. So there's two very fundamental premises of the Green New Deal. There's many variations on this, but basically it calls for a structural transformation of the way that our financial systems work, and the way that we raise funds to, I guess, operate governments and maintain our societies. And the second premise is that then we need a sustained program that we can use to invest in and deploy new ways of doing things, energy conservation, renewable energies, changing our demand and consumption patterns, transforming the way that we move around, the way that we grow food, the way we manage our land, the way we work. All things that have happened during COVID-19, not necessarily in the way that, perhaps the organised way that we want them to, but things that have happened. There's a few links if people do want to do a bit of reading up on some of this. Another one, we actually talked about this in the little breakout room I was in as well, is donut economics. I haven't read enough about this to be really sure. I find it a little bit conceptually challenging, but the idea is that the light green part in the middle, that's the sweet spot. Okay, that's the donut, where we are meeting people's needs while not overshooting the capacity of our planet to supply these needs. If we end up in the middle, in the shortfall area, we're not meeting everyone's needs. If we end up in the overshoot area, we're perhaps meeting those needs, but overshooting the capacity of our planet to supply these needs. And of course, at the moment, we're kind of in a bit of a double whammy, because we're not meeting everyone's needs, but we're also overshooting the capacity of our planet. So there's a couple of links there. Some of you might find the work by the Stockholm Resilience Centre quite interesting on lots of fronts as well, talking about this stuff. A more radical transformation is degrowth. Some of you may have come across Small is Beautiful, an economist called Eric Schumacher back in the early 70s, ideas around deep ecology. These are pretty radical transformations, significant reductions in consumption, particularly in developed countries, but also urgently developing opportunities for people in developing countries so that they can reach a good quality of life without causing the kind of environmental damage that we have. The focus is very much on small scale and self-sufficiency. And the bit, I guess, that people are quite uncomfortable about with this is that implicit in it is a much reduced population. And this is very much the deep ecology premise that was around probably in the late 70s, early 80s, and it's much more discomforting for a lot of people. I should talk very quickly about sustainable development. Been around for a while. I actually wrote my master's thesis on this in 1990. But as far as I'm concerned, it's become a meaningless concept. I think it's actually been very damaging for environmental and social justice movement, but it's been co-opted into this ecological modernisation area that we can keep on having economic growth, and that's okay as long as we don't completely trash the environment in the meantime. I like to replace it with a concept of sustainability, and this has been reconceptualised more recently and focusing very much on, first of all, long-term ecological sustainability, living within our ecological means, making sure we satisfy basic human needs, and also promoting this idea of inter and intra-generational equity. So that's where I'd like to see it taken, and that's where our just transition needs to take us. So that's about enough from me. Just to recap the 7 themes, and then Paul will take us into a chat. I'll just jump forward for a minute. I guess the chat is to think about what resonates with you about these themes. Are you resistant to some of them? Are there parts that you want to keep, reject, reform, all those sorts of things? So those are the 7 themes that you might want to focus on, or perhaps something completely different. And I'll hand back to you, Paul. I think I'll need to end the slideshow to do that. Yeah. find the meeting again. Oh, and I need to, there we go. How's that? Back to normal, whatever that is. Oh, Paul, you're still muted.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. Just going to give people a few, just a couple of minutes just to reflect on what you said. Before that, big thank you for that. That's incredibly, comprehensive overview of what's been going on in COVID and the implications of that. I suspect we will start a conversation today. I have no expectations that we'll finish it and conclude. But what I'd like to go now, as you suggested, is let people think about their responses and reactions, and then I'll break people out into groups to start the conversation. So if you'd like to sit quietly whilst you're thinking.
Do you want me to reshare the 7 themes again?
Would that help? Do people want to see them? Oh, I've got it on my slide deck actually, so I'll put it up on there. Okay.
No worries.
So some of you will be aware, I also sent out a question, so you might want to just consider this as well as part of your reflection. And I think one response I have is there are obviously things that we can influence externally in terms of some of those challenges, but also what is it that we possibly can think about internally in terms of helping us with our response ability to this, our responses to what we've been looking at. And it might, we might come up with conclusions of just small things that we can do, which we could explore. So I'm going to put you into five groups. I'm going to give you round about 16 minutes. So just over 3 minutes each to talk. I'll check in with this towards the end anyway, see how it's going on for you. Okay, so here we go. Come on, Judy, the cat's joining us.